Chain of evidence. Know where the evidence goes. Of all the things that you'll do, the first thing you'll do and the most important thing you'll do when performing a analysis or a forensic exam is maintaining or creating the chain of evidence, otherwise known as a chain of custody. It basically tells the court or any other body that may be reviewing your report how the data or the evidence was obtained, who touched it, where it came from and when, and who's had that piece of evidence throughout up until the court case itself. So let's talk about the evidence life cycle. It begins with the creation of the evidence. This is the date and time in which a piece of data was either written to a hard drive or CD-ROM, and it was actually created. This could have been done by a user or could have been done automatically by some application or program. After that, you'll go on to the identification of the evidence. Someone has determined that that device or that computer contains data or something that would be of evidentiary value in the case. At that point, it switches into collection of the evidence. This is where you physically obtain that data, either by taking the computer system or taking a hard drive, making an image of a computer system, or copying log files down to a CD-ROM or another hard drive, or even print it out on paper. After that is the analysis of the evidence. This is the biggest part you will play in this chain of evidence life cycle. You're going to be analyzing the evidence that was collected to see how it relates to the case at hand. After that is the storage of evidence. Where is that evidence stored? It's an original piece of equipment, or it could be a hard drive or CD-ROM, like we said before. Where is it stored? What is the physical location at? And around that physical location, what controls are in place to make sure that someone else cannot touch that evidence? The second to last thing would be the presentation of the evidence in court. You're presenting to the court how this data relates to the case and what it means to that case. At the end is the disposition of the evidence. How do you dispose of it? What do you do with a hard drive that may contain PII and personal information? Do we destroy it? Do we not? How is it destroyed? Was it returned? Who was it returned to? Was it lawfully returned to the correct person? All that comes back into disposition of the evidence. So as you see, once evidence is really a long cycle and involves many steps, and all of them are very important in the case overall. Why do we really care about chain of evidence? Well, because it's bookum, Dano. This may go criminal. It might go to court where you have to testify, yes, I had this, this is where it was kept, and nobody else touched it. Especially if it goes criminal. Chain of evidence is where they normally attack. Oh, you put it on a system and it got infected with malware from your forensic box, thusly contaminating the evidence, so we can't allow any of that coming into court, because we really don't know what our client created and what that malware created on the same piece of evidence. Yes, it is definitely, those two things alone are why we really care about chain of evidence. Civil procedure studies are getting even harder when it comes to chain of evidence. You'll have employee issues, such as the persons from France or Germany or Switzerland, Canada, where you may not be able to take the evidence out of country. So now where was it stored there? How did you access it? What was the chain there? Those can get very complex. Then on top of that, you'll have dream teams, where there's a group of people, law enforcement and civil, both, whose only job is to attack your chain of evidence, to show that your evidence is faulty, that it was contaminated. You placed that on your forensic workstation, and your forensic workstation had malware on it, and it contaminated the evidence that you're trying to present in court. So thusly, my client, we don't know what he produced or what was produced by your malware on your faulty machine. Those are the type of things that can be brought up, and normally are brought up, if you go into a large court matter. Think about the dream teams. A good example in the past was the O.J. Simpson trial. There was not a piece of evidence in that trial that did not showed that he was not guilty. Everything showed that he was guilty. But the Dream Team attacked the chain of evidence so well that almost all of it was thrown out of court. That's the kind of team that you may end up going against. So what is the golden rule? Well, it's actually a men's rule, but we'll set that aside. When handling evidence, remember, as few hands as possible. And I mean handling. Someone may spot it and say, hey, this could be evidence. Whoever physically touches it is what the chain of evidence really is about. So, few hands touching. As many eyes as possible. How many people saw that evidence but never touched it? That's another one that's very good, because you have people testify that it was collected properly, it was booked properly into a safe, etc. In fact, one of the easiest things for digital evidence that's not so true for physical evidence is that we're making copies. About the only time we actually touch the evidence is when we collect it, when we make a copy of it or image it, and when we dispose of it. That's about the least amount of times you can handle something. And what's nice is we can work off of that copy and say that that image was an exact copy of the original evidence, and this is what we found on it. One of the last things too is the integrity of the handler is also the key. What is that person's background? Believe me, attorneys will go into your Facebook, your MySpace, anything they can on social media to show that you really aren't credible, that you're not trained well, that you are sloppy, that day to day you are a very sloppy person. So how can you have handled this evidence in such a unique manner when day to day this is what you're like? So you never thought you'd have to be careful what you have on social media up to this point, did you? You have to show that, you have to make sure that you have a clean social media background, or if you can, just no social media background. One of the things you're going to be developing, and you'll have to develop, are guidelines. Guidelines are not policies, procedures, or processes. Those you have to follow word for word. A guideline you do not. That allows you some wiggle room in case you're running into something that you haven't seen before and that the guideline that's currently written doesn't exactly allow for it to be followed with that piece of evidence. And again, you have to take in the Fourth Amendment rights of individuals, as well as the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, the Publishers Protection Act. That's where you have to use a subpoena to get evidence rather than a search warrant. There's also DOJ guidelines when it comes to handling evidence, as well as you may have your local sheriff's office or police department, their guidelines on handling evidence. What is the court actually looking for in chain of evidence? It wants accountability. Who did what, when, where, and protection of the court's evidence. You have to remember the court will, once it goes to court, will look at the evidence as their evidence. So they want it properly documented. They want it preserved as best as possible. The chain of evidence should always show where did the evidence come from, when was it obtained, who obtained it. You know, it may have been pointed out by Paul that this is evidence, but Kathy obtained it. Who secured it? Sometimes, in some cases, someone may obtain it, then it's handed off to someone else to secure inside a safe. That should be in the chain of evidence. Who had control of it? Why it was in that safe? Who else had access to that safe? Only you? Or could other people have access to it that would have a key or that would know the combination to a safe? Where has it been stored physically? Once again, its location and the physical attributes around that location. Was it stored where it is, and where is it stored now? Has it been moved? Is it now with the courts and they're taking it? All that should be on a chain of custody form. So as we wind this down, let's review. What does the court want? They want seal and meal and documentation. Basically, that means they want to make sure that the evidence that was collected was properly sealed up so nobody else could touch it, unless they filled out a chain of custody form. Controlled access and documentation. Who had access to the evidence and where? And what is it documented as to who had access to it? You also have to audit your control access and documentation. It's not good enough just to say, oh, this is who had access to it, this is our procedures. It should be audited from time to time to make sure that that's the only people who have touched it. One set of hands, or as few as possible, but with as many eyes as possible. The court will look at that. Remember that. So you want only few people touching it, but a lot of people saw the fact that it was there. And I think the last but not least, it's the courts. They want everything documented as thorough and as plain as possible. So now a few caveats as we come to the last slide in this lecture. Everything you collect in the field should have, or you should do on the digital evidence, an MD5 or CRC hash. I know you've seen the lectures, you've seen the papers where they say MD5 and CRC. Both can be cheated, you might say. That someone can actually create a piece of evidence that would have the same MD5 hash as another piece of evidence. The ability to do that takes extreme resources, and mathematically is next to impossible to do when you're dealing with digital evidence that is 1 meg, 2 megs, a gig in size. If it's less than about 20 bytes, that is actually possible to do, but not when the numbers start getting big. Luckily for us, to make an MD5 hash, there's a lot of programs out there. You'll be given some within this class. And programs like InCase has it built into their system that every time that you add evidence to a case, it will automatically generate an MD5 hash, not of just the evidence, but of the sub-sectors like on a hard drive. And last but not least, remember that all links in your chain of custody must be strong. The defense will always go after the weakest link in that chain. And if all are strong, if all have been confirmed, then there's nothing for them to go after. Now on to our next class.